How's it, guys? Happy Monday. Here we go again. Chapter 10. Let's get those teas going. Right, let that steep for a bit. And we get started. Chapter 10. Mad Mike. Which is the better man? The greater throw may turn by fortune from the weaker hand. Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare. My receptionist knows that whenever Mrs. Ogden calls in for appointment for her son Mike, that she has to book an hour. It has become the norm. Judy, my assistant, and I look forward to having Mike come in. His mom tells us that it is the major event in his life when he comes to see us. Mike was involved in a motorcycle accident in the middle of Bulawayo when someone ran a red light. He has been a quadriplegic since, and his mom taught me to communicate with Mike by watching his eyes. If he raises his eyebrows, it's a yes. If they dart to the corner, it's a no. I talk for Mike when he gets a questioning look. I can usually guess right since I know him so well. If I can't guess, I quickly run through the consonants of the alphabet, and when I get the first letter of a word, continue until I have the key word, and then I can figure out what he wants to talk about. His teeth have to be cleaned by his mom, so they aren't very clean. He likes Coca-Cola, so he has a lot of cavities as well. And he never complains. He's always so grateful. We often just sit the whole hour and chat. Judy is a pretty black-haired, petite little lady who is always gracious and kind. She always holds Mike's arm and he loves her. In fact, you could say he adores her. She's the only woman in his life who treats him as though he's completely normal. If I were in his shoes, it would mean a lot to me, I know. Mrs. Ogden settles Mike in the desk chair and then leaves to wait in the waiting room and have tea with Phyllis, the receptionist. They are friends as well, and I can hear a constant nattering from down the hallway. Did you read the magazines I gave you last time? I asked Mike. His eyes dance. Which part? About bream, bass, boats, rods, lines? I quickly go over the articles in the last fishing magazine. There was an article about animals. About the animals. Bingo, and his face lights up with one of his special smiles. He makes a grunting, rattling noise, and drool runs out of his mouth. Judy moves in front of him, still holding his arm. I just love animals. I even have a pet klipspringer. He is such a little darling. Mike smiles at Judy and then frowns at me. Judy picks up the cue and asks Mike, "You want to know if Bill likes animals too?" His eyes tell us yes. "He is an animal," retorts Judy. We both laugh and he still looks questioningly in my direction. "So, you want to know all the details, right?" His eyes move up and down ever so slowly, ever so slightly. "Sit down, Judy. This is going to be a good one." I sit down on my stool with the wheels and lean back against the cupboard. Mike is in front of me, and Judy sits next to him, still holding his arm. His face radiates happiness. It looks like he's died and gone to heaven. He and the one he adores are ready for another story. Well, I'm going to get my tea before we proceed with Bill's story. It's probably steeped enough. Cheers. Alright. He and the one he loves are ready for another story. I tell Mike how I grew up in East Africa, traveling extensively, free and wild, always hunting or observing wildlife. I didn't have any formal education until I was sent to England when I was 12. Then I quit school for 18 months. Then I went to Heidelberg College, a school that went from primary school all the way to college. The only way I survived there was the fact that I had a good roommate who let me have all the animals I wanted without turning me into the housemaster. I had chameleons, snakes, and squirrels. The chameleon's name was George. One day George did a real number on me. I was all ready to go off to class when George came out of hiding and right in front of me produced a baby. I put down my books and watched George have another 12 babies. I was so excited I forgot all about class and went to the library instead and looked up about chameleons. I found out that they were ovoviviparous, which means they lay eggs inside themselves, and then when the babies hatch, they are pushed out. I also found out that puff adders are ovoviviparous. Then I went out and found a female puff adder and kept her in a pillowcase with the end tied under my bed. I couldn't tell a female chameleon from a male, obviously, but with a snake it was quite easy, because with snakes, especially the fat-bodied ones, like puff adders, females have what I call hips towards the end of their tail, whereas the male just tapered off gradually to the end. I learned a lot from my visits to the library. My other classes suffered greatly, however. I often failed classes in physics and English, and was often given the choice of hard labor or cuts with a cane due to the many missed classes. I would always choose cuts, because they would hit you twice with the cane, and that was that. Hard labor took hours, and besides, I had so many cuts by then that I hardly felt it anymore. That was like me growing up. Me and my sister, we used to make so much trouble, and we got disciplined by our dad so much that we stopped feeling it. We actually had to pretend to be. We'd pretend to be in pain, just so that he wouldn't change the punishment, because the cuts were not registering anymore. My puffera was Lady Nyoka. Translated from Swahili, it only meant lady snake. But Big John was with me when I caught her, and he named her Lady Nyoka. Big John was terrified of Lady Nyoka. Fact is, whenever I needed something, I would threaten Big John by telling him I would put Lady Nyoka in his house if he didn't come up with the goods, and I always got them. There was a fig tree at the bullpen up on the hill behind the dairy, and I never used to get a single fig until I got Lady Nyoka. I told Big John I wanted all the figs off that tree. I have a feeling he went around and threatened every black on the farm with his life, because for a whole month I ate the best figs I had ever eaten. Big John used to sit under the fig with his slingshot and shoot any birds that came by during his time off, just to make sure that I got my figs. I felt that I needed to reward Big John for his efforts, so I gave him a great coat that I had bought a couple of years previously when I had first gone to school. It was from the Second World War, and I thought it would be good to keep me warm. But everyone laughed at me so much that I didn't wear it except that night. Sure, I'd love to have a great coat from the Second World War. So I took Big John the coat. He loved it and wore it all winter, so I figured we were square on that deal. The biology lab had a cage full of mice, from which I would take only one little white mouse at a time back to Lady Nyoka. She soon got to realize that whenever I pulled her out from under my bed, it was mealtime. She didn't hiss and perform so much after that. She'd grab them and swallow them right in front of me. I showed one of my friends, and he was amazed. He asked me to tell when the next feeding time was, and then brought all of his friends. Pretty soon, my room was packed at feeding time. I got a large cardboard box and would put Lady Nyoka in the box and then put the mouse in there with her. She would just wait, coiled up in her corner, and when the mouse ran by, she would strike, and within seconds the mouse would just be a lump in her neck. The boys started to bring me other mice, so Lady Nyoka was eating almost every day, instead of once every 2 weeks. My favorite pet, however, was my squirrel Shindy. Oak Grove was the farm next to Helderberg. I used to spend a lot of time there collecting birds' eggs, and also during the season, the grapes were the best. There were a lot of guinea fowl, and I would hunt them with my throwing sticks, supplementing boarding school food. I discovered that there were a lot of grey squirrels, so in the spring I went out and soon found a nest with 4 babies. I took one of them and put it in my shirt. I took it back to school and bought an eyedropper. Every time I went to the dining room, I would bring back some milk and feed Shindy. She grew quickly, and pretty soon I was feeding her bread and pine cones brought in off the mountain. It wasn't long before I had taught Shindy to ride around inside my shirt. She would sleep while I was in class, and as soon as I had a chance, I would let her run around in the trees. Many of the boys knew I had a squirrel in my shirt, and one day in assembly, the chap next to me asked me if he could hold Shindy. "You can't," I whispered. "She'll bite you and cause trouble for me." "I have a squirrel of my own," he insisted. "I know how to hold them." "Okay, but just be careful with her." Against my better judgment, I pulled Shindy out of my shirt and passed her across. The first thing she did when she touched his band was bite him on the finger. He let out a shriek and tossed her in the air. She landed on a boy in the row in front of us, and immediately gave him a good nip. He let out a shout of amazement, and by then she had run down the line of boys looking for me, biting all the way. Boys were standing on their chairs, making a terrible din. Assembly came to a complete halt, and the housemaster came straight down to me and asked if it was my squirrel. I told him it was. "Get hold of it this minute," he commanded me. I ran down the line of boys, pushing them aside and calling her with a low clicking noise that squirrels use with each other. She came bouncing over to me and jumped into my shirt. I knew that if the housemaster got hold of her, she would come to a sticky end, so I ran out of the assembly hall and out into the trees. I put her up on one of the trees and told her goodbye. Then I went back to the hall and waited for my punishment. "Where's your squirrel?" grunted the housemaster. "I don't know, sir. I let her go. Come to my office with me. You have the choice of 3 stumps to dig or 6 cuts." The school had cut down a grove of huge eucalyptus trees, and the hard labor was digging out those monstrous stumps. My undersized body was not cut out for that task, so the cuts were inevitable. In his office, one of the prefects gave me 6 cuts on my backside. I didn't flinch or give out one moan. He also had snakes in his room, the prefect told the housemaster. "Let's go have a look," the housemaster said. We went to my room, and from under my bed, they took out the pillowcase that housed Lady Nyoka. I held her gently in my arms, stroking her so that she wouldn't be frightened by the presence of strangers. "I'll take that," the housemaster said, reaching for the snake. "Right, she's a venomous snake, sir," I warned. "Better you take it in this pillowcase." They took it outside, and one of the prefects killed my snake. I was then offered another choice of stumps or cuts. "I'll take the cuts, sir," I stated. "Stubborn boy, aren't you, Taylor?" "Yes, sir," I replied. I bent over, and on the 5th cut, the blood started to come through my pants. The prefect stopped and had the housemaster come around and have a look. "Ah, that's enough then," he said, and walked out of the office, leaving me with the 2 prefects. I didn't dare open my mouth in case my lower lip started to tremble. but I glared at them both and then gave them the 2-ups before leaving the room. I went back to my room and picked up George, who had been hiding behind the curtain. George had eaten all of her babies by now. I read and found out that in captivity, chameleons are cannibals. So it was just George, me, and my roommate. My roommate felt so sorry for me, he went out and bought half a gallon of ice cream, whipped it up and put it in the sink, and told me to sit down to cool my bum. I told him I would, but only if he left me to do it in privacy. As soon as he left, I ate it all with my fingers and then sat in the cold sink. That way, I was happy in front and in back. I look over at Mike, and he has this little smile on his face that is getting bigger by the second. A roar of laughter comes from deep down. He falls a bit over in my direction, and I lean partly forward to support him. My wheeled stool flies out backwards, and I land on the floor with Mike falling on top of me. Judy had been hanging onto him from the other side and has pulled over on top of Mike. "Get off me, Mike!" I shouted. "You're slobbering on me!" Mike continues to roar with laughter, and by this time Judy is having a giggling fit. Suddenly others join in our laughter. Mrs. Ogden, Phyllis, and all the staff from the laboratory next door are crowded into the hallways to see what all the commotion is about. With a bit of help, we get Mike into his wheelchair. "You're going to have to get another appointment, Mike," I tell him. "We spent all our time talking today." He raises his eyebrows. He smiles approvingly in my direction, and a little drool runs down the side of his face. Right. That's it for today, huh? Good night. Sleep well. See you tomorrow.